Kia ora, it's Chris with Earth Sciences New Zealand with this autumn seasonal climate outlook. We're tackling the months of March, April, and May. And look, this is a hard job, so we need some support. So we're going to bring in our good friend and esteemed colleague, John Tunster of Met Service and of Earth Sciences New Zealand. John, that's quite the name tag on your email signature, I got to say.
Sure is, and I've got the Earth Sciences background, the Earth Sciences mug.
Yeah, you're LinkedIn, and man, this must be crazy. Just titles and this. So anyway, enough of that. Let's talk about what to expect for autumn. I'm going to bring up the headlines, John. We'll disappear, and we'll go through these headlines. So over the next basically 3 months, we think La Nina will still be kind of a factor, but it is gone. How can that be the case, John?
Well, as we expected, the ocean aspect of La Nina has decayed away pretty much very well on schedule. Great forecast. Frankly, we expected that it would diminish in the oceans by either late summer or early autumn. That's what's happened. But we still have these lingering atmospheric residual impacts from it. And that's not unusual with La Ninas.
Yeah, the atmosphere has a memory, I guess, is another way of putting it. It kind of lags behind the ocean in some ways, you could say, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And which segues nicely into our next headline of needing to watch for rain-bearing events from the north. That is a quintessential sort of La Nina, theme, if you will. What we've seen this already in January and February, where we get these periodic episodes where our weather comes from the north. And if you're looking to extend summer, unusual warmth is most likely for the upper part of the North Island and the western part of the North Island. So let's go there, John. Let's go to temperature. We'll go off frame in just a minute here, but just to say hi and set the scene here, it's the northern and western part of the North Island where we think temperatures are going to be above average. What led us to that? Like, in other words, why have we excluded, say, other parts of the country from that above average theme?
Well, it took a while to get there, but so far this year we've seen occasional onshore easterlies and occasional southerlies that have really acted to suppress daytime temperatures in a lot of eastern areas. And we may not necessarily see it to the same extremity that we have seen on occasion this summer, but we'll still see those occasional easterlies and southerlies and probably fewer of the hot northwesterlies.
So as we disappear and go full frame, let's talk about impacts. What does this mean for people watching this for, say, the upper and western North Island? What are some things that perhaps they can expect as we progress through autumn in terms of a temperature impact?
Well, in terms of temperatures, I think that we'll still be seeing just elevated daytime temperatures and nighttime temperatures. And one thing worth noting is that we could still see some bursts of humidity affecting those areas as well. With these easterly flows that are tapping into that warm air to our northeast, we've already seen that happen so far this summer, and I don't think that's just going to just disappear in the near term.
Speaking of disappear, we'll do that for a second. So I guess for northern and western parts of the North Island, perhaps people may be hitting the beach a bit longer into the season, potentially, if we get those warm days, right? Maybe being outside a bit longer, perhaps extending the growing season a bit longer, maybe more favorable growing conditions for the farmers. For other parts of the country, say the western part of the South Island, a warm lean, I guess we could say, right? But confidence not quite so high. Perhaps we get some easterly winds and a bit of a reverse firn. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's right. We can get well into late autumn. You can see temperatures hitting mid-20s sometimes in those reverse ferns for the West Coast, which is, pretty decent for the West Coast. And we're not saying that that's going to happen every single day for the upcoming season, but there's an elevated chance of those kind of situations happening.
Yeah, and for the eastern parts of both islands, we could see some flicks of southerly, as you mentioned earlier, some southerlies that can keep temperatures down. Let's go to the more challenging one, which is rainfall, coming back on screen here. We have some diverse colors on the map, as we'll see in a second once we disappear, but it's really the northern and eastern part of the south of the North Island, I beg your pardon, John, where we think, look, if it's going to be a wetter than average autumn season the next 3 months, it'll be these areas. So what's going on here? Why the indication for wetness potentially?
Well, I think what we'll see is any high pressure systems that are coming through are most likely to sit a little bit further south than they normally would. That's again a La Nina type pattern. And that sort of opens the door to various features intruding from the tropics and subtropics every now and then. Now, what this may actually eventuate as is a relatively small number of potentially significant events dropping down. So we could have these sort of long settled periods as highs sit over the country, and then those highs sometimes wake up the tropics, and then we have to watch for those lows to come down. And they do tend to have a bit more likelihood of affecting the upper and eastern North Island.
So a bit of a boom or bust. I think, was it our colleague Nick that coined that phrase that we're sort of reusing?
I think so. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a good way of putting it, and it's we've seen it a few times so far this season. For example, if we just quickly look back to what's happened in February,
Yep.
we've seen some prolonged settled periods, but 80% of the time it may not be raining in a lot of places, but then 20% of the time we have these really significant lows, dumping a huge amount of rain.
Yeah.
Very spiky rainfall patterns, and we could see that continue for at least part of the autumn.
We should mention we are recording this on the 4th of March, March 4th. So let's talk about other parts of the country. That risk for wetness maybe not quite as strong for the western part of the North Island. So that's why we're thinking we're kind of hedging our bets, if you will. So anywhere from that normal or above normal category. And look, if it's going to be dry, John, it's the west of the South Island. What led us to that, that outcome?
Yeah, that's a pretty strong signal in the seasonal models and in our outlook. It's primarily due to high pressure systems sitting further south than they normally would. Sometimes they'll push onto the South Island entirely, and sometimes they'll be slightly further south, and you get an easterly flow from those. Neither of those setups really bring much or any rain to the west coast of the South Island. So that was the justification behind that.
Yeah, and look, to your point about this, going through these cycles where the rainfall being quite spiky. I mean, as I say, we're recording this on the 4th of March. And look, for the next 5 days, we're in that sort of bust period where there's going to be very little rain. I'm going to disappear both of us here, John. And so we have the ensemble modeling on screen. So on the left-hand side, for those who are not too familiar, think of that as a dry scenario, what a dry outcome could look like in terms of one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum on the far right where I'm pointing, that's a wet scenario. If things got really wet, could look something like that. And in the middle, that's basically saying there is about a 50% chance that the rain could be either more or less than what is indicated. And John, the North Island, holy smokes, very little rain through very early Monday morning. It's really the western part of the... Now, so look, this is a great example of a weather forecast and the climate outlook. Coming back on screen, you can see how all three scenarios give a decent amount of rain for the western and lower part of the South Island. But John, we just said it's going to be below normal, but it's a wet place too. So walk us through that. How can both be true?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I was actually just looking at the Met Service severe weather outlook, which actually has Fiordland highlighted over several days for potential heavy rainfall. So what we have here is basically, it is a high pressure dominated scenario, but we basically have this front that's being squeezed between these two highs. There's the high that's over us in the short term and drifting away, and then another high pushing in. And in between those, we have a bit of a front, and that sort of lags around Fiordland for quite a while, and then may push on to the lower and eastern South Island briefly, bringing a bit of rain there, but never really having any consequence on the North Island.
Yep. So we'll be in this bust period for much of the country for the next 4, 5, 6 days, but looks like things are going to change. Let's go to, actually, I do want to mention real quick before we go to our 5-week outlook. There is dryness that has emerged in parts of the far north, so we're mindful that the rainfall has been inadequate for places like Kaitaia, Cape Reinga, and also over interior Otago. We have seen a real lack of rainfall. Let's go to the next 5 weeks, John. So this is the 5-week period from the 2nd of March, so basically 2nd through the 9th of March. And you can see that boom or bust sort of scenario, a lot of dryness across the country. Now, this, John, this is the 9th through the 16th. We do need to sort of give an audio edit to this. So what we're looking at here,
Yes.
walk us through what may be different than, I guess if we were to look at an updated map, which we have off camera, we probably wouldn't see this brown across the upper North Island, right?
Correct. Yeah, this is, as you said, we need to tap dance a little bit around this image. This is just one model run, and there's a lot of variability coming up at the moment. Probably, I think everyone in the country should be most aware that the sort of the 9th to the 15th is a period of particular interest. This high pressure that we were just talking about in the previous slides drifts away, and it may open the door to the tropics starting from roughly the 9th to the 10th. Now, of course, when we have things come down from the tropics, their tracks can vary quite dramatically. Their tracks, their depths, and all sorts of things like that.
And not to mention, the upper North Island's a pretty thin part of the country, so it wouldn't take much to go, left or right, and, you're pretty much a spectator.
Exactly. Yeah, we shouldn't be taking this exact distribution as gospel by any means at the moment. There's certainly some pretty interesting chances that the upper North Island could see significant rain from this upcoming system.
All right, so just a reminder, it looks like roughly the 11th, 12th, 13th, somewhere around there, we have to keep an eye on Tairāwhiti Gisborne, maybe Hawke's Bay, Coromandel, Auckland, Northland. So keep an eye on the weather forecast, the watches, the warnings. Met Service has you covered as we progress through time. Again, as this is as of the 4th of March, and things will change. Let's go through the next few weeks continuing. You can see those themes. Boy, what is this? So the last week of March, it turns super green. You think this is legit, worth watching?
I think it's worth watching. I think this period is jumping around a bit in time. What I see most likely is happening is we're seeing this window starting around about 9th, 10th, 11th, where we need to keep our eyes on the tropics. That will probably push through over several days, whatever that feature actually ends up being. We'll probably see something settled pushing in behind that. Most likely another high will eventually come in behind. And what we're seeing here is the chances that that high sort of outlives its lifespan, and we again start to keep our eyes to the north again. I wouldn't say that this particular time period is nailed on. It could push into early April, but I would say that when we get that settled period pushing in after mid-month, we still have to keep our eyes on the tropics. It is worth noting that we're still pretty much in peak tropical cyclone season. It has been a very quiet tropical cyclone season for us locally. Yeah. And so that could lend a bit of, you don't want to sort of rest on your laurels around that. The whole sort of March, April period could easily see cyclones form and come down. So keep an eye on the north.
So just in review, even though we have above normal rain for the next 3 months for the autumn season as the most likely outcome for northern and eastern parts of the North Island, there is a risk we could see above normal rainfall, just a bit more uncertain for eastern parts of the South Island and, for that matter, the western part of the North Island. But John, coming back on camera, really want to reiterate that sort of extended dry and settled periods sort of interspersed with these rain-bearing events. So it's, to use whatever metaphor you want, boom or bust, feast or famine, it's going to be quite lumpy, it looks like. And rainfall is inherently lumpy, but perhaps more than usual. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think we will probably see relatively few systems, but some of those systems have the chance to produce quite a lot of rainfall.
All right. Well, coming back on camera, what is this? So, this is a bit of a different image. We see a lot of years up top. Just walk us through, give us the sort of elevator pitch of what we're looking at and why this is something that may be useful.
So we're going really old school here. This is basically what we call analog forecasting, where we try to find historical instances where certain climate drivers were very similar to how they are now. So basically what I did was I selected these years for being La Niñas that were present in January but not present in April, so decaying La Niñas. And I did this analog for the summer season, and frankly, it worked out it was pretty good. So I thought, well, we should have a look at the autumn season and see what that's indicating as well.
So that's MAM, March, April, May, just so for people know.
Yes.
VCSN basically is what we use to understand weather, historical weather, and not looking at climate stations, but looking at points pretty much anywhere in the country. It's a little bit nerdy, but just trust us. It's something we can, that's our baseline, what we call climatology. But John, like what I'm looking at, so the blue is indicating, and will disappear, the blue is indicating that in these years, when you consider all these years that I'm pointing to, 76 through to 2025, and you put them in a blender and mix it up in those years where we had a La Nina in January, but no La Nina in April. So as you say, a decaying La Nina. The blue is indicating where the rainfall was, what, higher than usual, and the warm colors, or the orange and the reds, that's lower than usual rainfall during the autumn season?
That's right, yeah. It's basically showing in a nice, neat picture this idea that a decaying La Nina in the autumn season still has these La Nina type effects on New Zealand. It's something that we see very often with decaying La Ninas, and this just puts it into one picture. It supports, generally speaking, our seasonal outlook. It supports a lot of
well, I was going to say,
modeling.
you look at like the northern and east, I mean, if you just do a little comparison, like upper and eastern North Island where I'm pointing, we're indicating, look, if it's going to be a wetter than usual autumn, those two areas are worth watching. And we're saying, look, if there's going to be a reduction or below normal rainfall for the western part of the South, there'd be the western part of the South Island. And you come back and you look at that and you're like, holy smokes, that kind of lines up. It's not perfect, but it's not bad either.
That's right, yeah. Analog forecasting is an inherently risky game because this is looking at one variable in the entire climate system. But it does give us at least some physical links to things that are affecting us.
Real quick, before I move on to a bit of a nerdy section, and I'll disappear, what are some impacts that we can deduce? What can we tell people? We talked about in terms of rainfall, we talked about the sort of boom or bust, all or nothing kind of rainfall where it's dry for several days, and then potentially we get these infrequent but impressive rainfall events. For people watching right now, what's the takeaway? What are some things that we can tell them in terms of what that means?
Yeah, those spiky rain events can be quite impactful, especially if they fall onto soils that get quite dry and can't necessarily take a huge amount of rain just falling in a short amount of time. We often hear from farmers that this type of rainfall is not particularly useful. It basically just doesn't necessarily soak into the soils effectively. One thing we need to be aware of is that if there is something focusing on us from the north, we need to keep up to date with the forecasts because we do see that the tracks of these things can really change, even up to days in advance. And the tracks of these systems will determine which areas will see the most rainfall and which will see a little bit less.
So while the threat for these big rainfall events are going to be they're not going to be there all the time because of this boom or bust, but I guess things to consider when the risk for a northerly friend, if you will, coming from our subtropics and tropics, you got to think about flooding and slips and those sorts of impacts. But what about folks maybe who may be looking at, say, rainfall that is subpar, below normal? What are some impacts that we can think about and tell people for areas in the western and lower South Island?
Yeah, well, we already saw on the drought index you had up earlier, there was a small area in central Otago that was flagging up there. We could see those areas start to grow over time. And that could be impactful for growth during the remainder of the autumn season.
Maybe a fire risk as well, potentially?
Quite possibly, yeah. Especially areas if there's any areas that have been wet prior to this, there's a lot of grass and scrub growth around, and if that dries out, could be concerning.
And obviously, hydro catchments, that's where a lot of our storage occurs for generation of electricity. So something I presume we'll have to be mindful of, and they'll be interested in as we progress through the next 3 months, I would think.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, John. Well, look, we got a few minutes here, but we can't leave without getting nerdy. So here we go, buddy. For those who are first-time viewers, here we go. Let me get this up here. I'm trying to drive here. So this is a section where John and I, particularly John, we sort of let down our hair, what's left of it anyway for me, and we say, right, what's going on? What are the climate drivers? We get into it. So for the next maybe 5 to 7 minutes, this is kind of a technical session, but we'll have a lot of fun. So John, I'm going to have you disappear, and I'm going to hit play here. Walk us through what we're looking at and why it's a big deal.
So check out the cold tongue in the Pacific. That's the La Nina area, which is basically our main climate driver, and we can see that it's shrinking over time. On the next slide, when we see the subsurface temperatures, things will get really even more interesting. But in the waters directly to our northeast, you can see that we have this persistent area of warm water. We've sort of in-house been calling it the blob after a similar such thing that's occurred in the Northern Hemisphere in recent years. So we have these two features that are impacting us. La Nina, as we've talked about at length, has an impact on us. It is going away, and we'll see on the subsurface why that might be. Now, this area to our northeast is important because any air that we source from that region in northeasterlies will bring extra moisture with it. So more humidity, warmer temperatures, and potential for more rainfall. We've already seen just a sneak preview of various climate summaries that may be coming out quite soon. We've seen some very warm humidity values in New Zealand over the last month or so. Things are very interesting in the Eastern Pacific. I think if we run forwards further in time, we're talking about the decaying.
I've circled that area of South America. Go for it, buddy.
Yeah, so La Nina is decaying away, but what we end up with is a very interesting pattern turning up in the Eastern Pacific. As time goes on, we'll start to see some warm temperatures appearing there. My Spanish is not the best, but I believe that's called El Nino Costero.
El Nino Costero.
Very good. Nice. Now, these are quite interesting. Sometimes these precipitate basin-wide El Nino events. Sometimes they don't. The truth is that even though we're at a time of year when predictability for future El Ninos is quite low, we're starting to think that this could be the harbinger of a potential El Nino later in the year. And right, this is the subsurface.
Oh, you go for it, buddy. This is drooling material. I just wanted to bring you back on screen so we can kind of segue to this image. So before you talk about it, what we're looking at is. So this right here, just to set it up, and John, over to you in a second. So we're looking at just the skin or the top of the ocean. But when we bring this image in, what we're doing is we're looking at the top of the ocean, which is right here where I'm pointing, the top of the image. But you can see on this axis, what we call the y-axis, you can see this is depth. So we go from 50 to 100, 200, even down to 450 meters. So pretty deep in the ocean. And we're looking across the ocean like a cross-section from basically the Gulf of Carpentaria all the way to South America. And we're looking at what the ocean looks like in terms of temperatures at depth. John, why is this a big deal? And help us make sense of this.
So we've been monitoring this for several months. The change has been quite incredible. I think that this shows the real attack on La Nina quite significantly. All we've got is this tiny little cold area up near the central Pacific, near the surface, but it is basically under siege from all angles. This very warm water below the surface has been pushing eastwards. It's now starting to emerge in the Eastern Pacific, and this is going to be our source for a whole big change in the Pacific Basin.
So John, but in order for an El Nino to form, we need this dipole, and that is unusually cool ocean temperatures to the west and unusually warm temperatures to the east. But is it me, or are we not seeing that? And what does that mean?
Not right now. No, that's right. I think in some respects we are entering somewhat uncharted territories because we are very likely to get warm waters in the Eastern Pacific later this year, probably in the middle of this year. Will we get the corresponding cold waters in the Western Pacific? That's a little bit less clear. So we'll see something that looks quite El Nino-like, certainly in the Eastern and Central Pacific, but we're not quite sure what will happen in the Western Pacific.
So it looks like we are heading toward El Nino, but that's probably going to take a bit of time. So in the meantime, we're still going to have these La Nina-like hiccups, as we said toward the top of the, bringing this up. We still, La Nina is gone, but still a factor. And that really is a tip of the hat toward what is likely to happen as we look at the subsurface, right, and at the surface. It's going to take some time for those El Nino conditions to persist. And also, John, with this warm water still at depth and near the surface in the central and western Pacific, that the atmosphere is going to respond to that. Isn't that right?
That's right. Yeah, this is a real interesting image. I think that this shows the potential flip very nicely that we might see, because I see that, as you say, La Nina is going away, but we've got these lingering impacts from it over the next coming months. But I think as we go into winter, things will look quite different. So as it stands in March, we've got this rising area of air over the maritime continent. If we track forwards in time, this is going to change quite dramatically as we enter into winter. You can see it's a complete flip. Instead, we've got basically sinking motion over the maritime continent, and it's trying to make rising motion over the Eastern Pacific. That is starting to look pretty El Nino-like in the atmosphere.
But until then, we're seeing these sort of pockets, these flavors of rise. So the cool colors, just to set this up if you're new to this, where you see these sort of teal or cool colors, that is where rising motion, large-scale rising motion is favored, and that's what usually generates or supports things like rain, thunderstorms, and basically unsettled weather. And when you see this area of sort of orange or red or pink, that's sinking motion, and that basically suppresses or limits things like rain or convection or thunderstorms. And so we still see that, John, don't we, in April, kind of over the maritime continent, the Coral Sea, and even into May, potentially, near and east of the country. But to your point, holy smokes, June is look at that. That's huge, right?
Yeah. It's dramatic. Yeah, I think this talks to our story very very accurately. I think it'll take several months to kick off La Nina type patterns for us, which basically means keep your eyes to the north. But things could start to look quite different as we enter winter.
So I'm going to put you on the spot here. If an El Nino were to emerge, let's say during winter, historically, and look, we all know the average outcome, but every El Nino is different, especially in the context of a warming climate. And we're seeing the ocean temperatures warm in a lot of places, broadly speaking, in the tropical Pacific. Is there anything we can glean in terms of, like, we just talked about the autumn outlook and people, what's winter going to be like? Anything we can chuck people's way in terms of what, apart from dark nights and bright days, is there anything we could say about autumn, given the direction of travel with El Nino?
So what this makes me think is that it's going to enhance the seasonal change we usually see in winter, which is normally in summer and autumn, high pressure systems tend to sit just south of Australia in the Australian Bight. In winter, they get hoovered up onto the Australian continent. I think that this type of pattern will enhance that tendency. What that means is that I think we'll see high pressure systems much further out to our west during winter, which effectively means a lot of general southwest flows for us.
So maybe not the warmest, but also not the wettest.
Yeah, I think that we would see periodic fronts coming through in that, which would tend to focus on the south and west of the country. Cooler, yes. And some areas I think would probably actually start to dry out under that scenario.
Yeah. Well, plenty of time to keep our eyes on that. But, Yeah. In the meantime, we'll just recap what you can expect for the next 3 months, and then we'll call it a wrap. So, above average temperatures. If that were to happen, a warmer than usual autumn, we think the northern and western part of the North Island is most favored. Western part of the South Island could happen, but still a bit iffy. Near average temperatures for the rest of the country. And in terms of rainfall, look, we have to watch out for these spiky rain events. Going to be some long dry spells, but when it rains, there are chances for some heavy rain events, particularly for northern and eastern parts, because of some northerly friends, if you will. And then for the western part of the South Island, that is where dryness is something we'll have to watch for. John, thanks for coming, and thanks for the insights. We appreciate it. We'll see you next time. And for a read of the autumn or seasonal climate outlook, you head to, I wasn't going to say NIWA, John, but I got to get out of that habit. It's Earth Sciences New Zealand. You want to head into that, and it's some great reading. We'll see you next time. Ngā mihi nui.